My name is Seth Kunin. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the faculty, and I've been asked to introduce tonight's inaugural speaker. The speaker, of course, is Julian Reiss, who is a newly hired professor of philosophy at the university. He's been here just under a year. And it's a great honor for us to have him here, and I think that tonight's talk on why economics needs philosophy will be fascinating. But I just should say a few things before I ask him to come up about him and about what we're doing here at Durham University. First of all, Julian Reiss had his PhD from the University of London, and then a very varied career, particularly in Europe, where he came to us from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So it's nice to get people moving in this direction from Europe and broadening our experience with people who have experience from different systems. So that's a fantastic aspect. Now, one of the things, aside from the fact that he came to work in the philosophy department, which is, in a sense, important and an honorable move in itself, he also came, along with Nancy Cartwright, and Wendy, who is here as well, I think, they're sitting in the front, to establish a new center for us, which is a very exciting initiative, the Center for Humanities Engaging Science and Society. And as you can see from the title of tonight's talk, Why Economics Needs Philosophy, here we have philosophy engaging with economics, which is exactly the kind of thing that this new center is about. And I think it's a really exciting initiative and should really be transformative, both for the philosophy department and the faculty, and hopefully for the university itself in terms of both the social sciences and the sciences. And we're looking forward to Julian and his colleagues reaching out well beyond philosophy to the university as a whole. And it was nice to see John Ashworth here from the philosophy department, not the philosophy department, the economics department, to see that we already have people coming in from the other faculty to hear what philosophers have to say about them. And it would be very interesting to hear from John at the end of the talk to find out if he thinks after that economics does need philosophy. But in any case, I think that just to mention some of Julian's publications, particularly The Philosophy of Economics, a contemporary introduction, which obviously relates directly to the talk tonight, and an earlier publication in 2008, Error in Economics, the Methodology of Evidence-Based Economics, which again is directly related to the kinds of issues that he'll be addressing. So without more ado, I'd like to ask Julian to speak to us, and I'm sure we'll have a very exciting and engaging talk from him.
Let's hope. Thanks very much, Seth, for that kind introduction and also for giving me a job, of course. And thanks to everyone for coming, especially actually to my parents who had to trek all the way here from Hamburg, and all of you. What I'm going to do tonight is to use the financial crisis as an opportunity to talk about a number of foundational problems, foundational issues in economics, all of which arose entirely within economics, but all of which are philosophical in nature and which are very nice areas to demonstrate that a mutual engagement between economics and philosophy can be, should be, will be very fruitful. The financial crisis is just a peg here because the criticisms might have arisen, the issues might have arisen without it. But it's really a wonderful opportunity for economic methodologists, because the first time in my lifetime anyway, it is that certain kinds of criticism are raised from within the economics profession. So you've always had critiques of economics coming from heterodox schools of economics, such as Marxist economics, from without the discipline, from different orientations within economics. But now economics, the nature, the soul of economics, so to speak, is being criticized from within the very discipline. And so I'm going to start talking a little bit about the financial crisis and just showing what some very prominent mainstream economists have said about it. So here are just some facts about the financial crisis, all of which I'm sure you know. So the crisis is considered by many to be the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's caused numbers and numbers of failures. So collapse of large financial institutions, bailout of banks by national governments, downturns in stock markets, numerous evictions, unemployment, foreclosures, prolonged vacancies in the housing market all around the world, and of course a global recession. And of course the current sovereign debt crisis in Europe is also a direct result of the financial crisis. But interesting for us is that many voices, in particular within economics and in the media, have blamed the crisis on economics itself. So they say that economics, actually, the profession, economists, have been very important in bringing about the crisis. And so here are a number of voices saying just that. So this is Joseph Stiglitz. Does this not work? Well, it doesn't seem to work. But anyway, Joseph Stiglitz, very famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, and here's what he says. The main cause of the crisis was the behavior of the banks, largely a result of misguided incentives unrestrained by good regulation. But then he's talking about Credential accomplices. There's one other set of accomplices, the economists who provided the arguments that those in the financial markets found so convenient and self-serving. These economists provided models based on unrealistic assumptions of perfect information, perfect competition, perfect markets, in which regulation was unnecessary. Bad models. Next guy, again, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Last year, Paul Krugman. Last year, everything came apart. Few economists saw our current crisis coming, but this predictive failure was the least of the field's problems. More important was the profession's blindness to the very possibility of catastrophic failures in the market economy. Again, absence of the right kind of theory. Here's a quote from The Economist, also a magazine which is not exactly known to be very hostile to economics. But they are talking here about, what went wrong with economics. And if you read the article, you'll find this. There are three main critiques: that macro and financial economists helped cause the crisis, that they failed to spot it, and that they have no idea how to fix it. Well, that's pretty damning criticism, isn't that? So, they can't explain it, they don't have policy recommendations, and they didn't foresee it. And the last one here, again by very famous economists, for instance, David Colander, Katrina Juszelius, Alan Kerman. The global financial crisis has revealed the need to rethink fundamentally how financial systems are regulated. Over the past 3 decades, economists have largely developed and come to rely on models that disregard key factors that drive outcomes in asset and other markets. It is obvious, even to the casual observer, that these models fail to account for the actual evolution of the real-world economy. In our hour of greatest need, societies around the world are left to grope in the dark without a theory. That, to us, is a systemic failure of the economics profession. Again, so I guess you get the gist. Now, while the financial crisis has surely sort of brought certain kinds of issues, problems, foundational problems of economics to our attention, I think it would be hard to maintain that the crisis has been instrumental in pushing economics into crisis. And this is simply because, in a way, one might argue, economics has been in a state of crisis ever since it started, or ever since it was divorced from philosophy. And just to give you a very brief history of economic crises within economics, you know that essentially economics was born with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations that was published in 1776. First crisis, about 70 years later. So at the time, so of course, for Adam Smith, economics was still squarely within moral philosophy. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. And in a sense, one can say that the Wealth of Nations was just a chapter within his overall moral philosophy. But then along came Ricardo, David Ricardo, whom you might know, and who formulated an entirely different economics based on very abstract principles, used only deductive mathematical reasoning, and divorced economics from ethics pretty much. So probably most of you will know the theory of the comparative advantage, and so he uses in his entire book, he uses all these little toy thought experiments, 2 countries, 2 products, and so on. And, you know, what do we intuit about a situation like that, and derives large consequences from that. Richard Jones, he was a friend of John Herschel's and William Whewell's. And Herschel and Whewell at the time were the most prominent philosophers of science, one can say. So both had written treatises on scientific method, and both were followers of Bacon. And so Bacon, of course, is the first sort of inductive philosopher of induction, and they were in a way followers in that way and developers of Baconian ideas. And so they wrote textbooks on scientific method, on inductive scientific method. And Richard Jones, the political economist, thought, well, that's good scientific method, Baconian method, so why don't we do that also in economics against the Ricardian tradition that was dominant at the time, that was deductive. And so he thought, well, he worked very, very hard on his book. It took him 10 years to collect all the observations. And then he found that certain of the so-called laws in Ricardian economics were actually false, because Ricardo would only have experience with Britain at his time. But if you looked a little bit further afield, to other periods, to other countries, and so on, you found violations of those laws. And so what he did in his book then is to apply inductive Baconian method to economics and to establish different kinds of generalizations. However, just about 10 years later, John Stuart Mill came along, and he was influenced by Richard Jones, but on the other hand, provided the still arguments against induction in economics that are still being used today. So essentially he says induction in economics is impossible because there's no crucial experiment in economics. And therefore, we have to learn about the economy deductively from first principles, and they are luckily already known to us. And Mill won in this argument. And philosophers of economics still go back to Mill, actually, and I teach a lot of Mill in my classes on philosophy of economics. And there were various very similar debates which popped up about every 50 or 60 years. I won't go into any details here, but the famous Methodenstreit between Gustav Schmoller and his German historical school of economics and Karl Menger and his Austrian school of economics was in a way just a repetition of that earlier debate between a concrete and inductive and ethical economics versus a deductive, abstract economics that tries to separate science from ethics or economics from ethics. There was also this, the Werturteilsstreit, which was sort of slightly different because Max Weber actually is a student, or was a student of Gustav Schmoller's, and that concerned the exact role of values in science. But it's not so important. But then again, 50 years later, you had the measurement without theory debate in economics, which in a sense, again, was a recap of that earlier debate. And so just what I wanted to say here, in all these debates, in all these crises, foundational debates within economics, there was this opposition between these guys on the right who thought that economics should be abstract, focusing on a small selection of causal factors, proceed deductively, so we reason about economic principles by deriving these principles from certain first principles, and the separation of ethics and economics. And all these guys here on the left try to promote an economics that is concrete and starts from everyday observations, that proceeds inductively by observation, comparison, generalization, and causal explanation, and where ethics and economics isn't separate. And it's not a surprise then that now, 50 to 60 years later, after that last debate, there's a similar debate again, right? And anyway. Now here's one last thing about the crisis, which I would like to mention, because it highlights exactly the three aspects, the three cases that I would like to talk about. So some research results by extremely prominent economists, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, were understood by the wider press, but in policy circles also, to say something like that. If the ratio between public debt and GDP exceeds 90%, then bad things will happen. It's really bad for growth, for instance. And so here's a quote from their 2010 paper where they say roughly something like that. The sharp run-up in public sector debt will likely prove one of the most enduring legacies of the 2007-9 financial crisis in the United States and elsewhere. We examined the experience of 44 countries spanning up to 2 centuries of data on central government debt, inflation and growth. Our main finding is that across both advanced countries and emerging markets, high debt GDP levels, 90% and above, are associated with notably lower growth outcomes. Now, they're very careful, of course, and use associated here and not causally responsible. However, in the public media, but as well as in policy circles, this was read as a causal claim, and it was used to support austerity policies, right? Which is really important. But then, so this Amherst grad student, in an ordinary econometrics class, tried to replicate these findings and found himself unable to do so. So he tried whatever, and eventually he asked Reinhardt and Rogoff for the Excel spreadsheet to replicate their findings, and then he found this. Well, he found that they made very, very silly errors. So one of the mistakes they made was they just copied, in an Excel spreadsheet, they copied the wrong range of cells and used that wrong range of cells. But they also made highly dubious methodological choices and analyzed data highly selectively. And so, of course, the political left is now very happy about this, and austerity policies are destroyed now, and so on and so forth. And that's not so important. But what's important here is that this episode highlights that there are 3 problems here. One is that there are issues with respect to economics theoretical foundations, because the Reinhardt-Rogoff studies are purely empirical, and there is no theory whatsoever that in any way supports that there should be this cutoff point of 90% beyond which the growth will be a lot lower. But there are also problems with the methodological foundations because, well, Hernan says that these are really stupid methodological choices. They defend their choices. So we'd like to have some principles that tell us, well, these are good choices or these are bad choices. Who's right in this debate? But lastly, there are also ethical problems. So we might ask, for instance, whether Reinhardt and Rogoff have the requisite epistemic integrity. You see, they made really very, very silly errors here. And shouldn't you you do your research very carefully, especially if it's likely to have such dramatic consequences? Again, their research was used as an excuse, maybe, for austerity policies. And also, shouldn't you perhaps publish results that can have dramatic political and so on effects without a warning? Shouldn't you say in the conclusions of your paper, well, look, this is just a correlation, so please don't base economic policies just on that, for instance. And anyway, so that's just the lesson I want to take here. And these 3 issues, theoretical ones, methodological ones, and ethical ones, and I want to talk about a case from each of these. Case 1, then, comes from rational choice theory. So, as I'm sure you all know, rational choice theory, economics is based on a theory of rational choice. And this theory is quite a peculiar one. So it's a very important engine. It drives predictions, it drives explanations, it drives policy analysis. It's highly, highly important, but it's a slightly, well, anyway, it's an interesting theory. The core assumption of this theory, the 2 core assumptions, are that people have preferences, and that these preferences are complete. So, among all the alternatives you can choose between, you can rank all the different alternatives. So, just imagine you're facing apples, bananas, and cabbage, And so for each pair of the two, of the three, you can say whether you like one better or the other, or whether you're indifferent between them. So it's complete, but also you can rank them in a way that no cycles ensue. So if you prefer apples to bananas and bananas to cabbage, then you must prefer apples to cabbage, right? And so these are the main assumptions, the main axioms of rational choice theory. However, if you want to do any empirical work with this kind of theory, you need to assume more. So one of the things you need to assume is that people's preferences are stable, because, of course, you don't know what people's preferences are. And so if you, say, want to make any predictions concerning behavior, you have to measure the preferences first, and then find out about the preferences first, and then use that knowledge in order to make predictions. And therefore, between two situations, you need the stability of preferences, right? So if they change, you can't use that for predictions or explanations and so on. And of course, that's a problematic assumption. As a child, I wanted to be a mechanic more than everything else. I don't, have that preference any longer, but it's not crazy for me to have lived and learned, right? So stability, but then, if you just say, over reasonable amounts of time, for instance, between two experimental rounds, preferences should be stable. That's not quite crazy. But then there's this other assumption called invariance, and that is a lot more problematic. And so invariance is essentially that you have to ask, what do people have preferences over? Usually, one says that it's consumption bundles. But very often, context might matter, might make a difference. And so, in a sense, you should have preferences over consumption bundles in a context. But there's very, very little theoretical insight about what this context is, in what sense context is allowed to affect our preferences. And just take a silly example. So I like to ride my bike anyway. When I lived in the Netherlands, I used to love riding my bike. And in the Netherlands, I prefer to ride on the right side of the street over riding on the left side of the street. Well, now that I moved to the UK, I prefer to ride on the left side of the street over riding on the right side of the street. Now, that doesn't seem crazy, right? It rather seems very, very reasonable. And so context can affect our preferences, but to what extent and what features of the context are allowed to affect your preferences. Now, economists have an answer because they use a specific variant of the invariance assumption, and that is called irrelevance from independent alternatives. And to explain this, I go back to this guy here. He's called Sidney Morgenbesser, philosopher at Columbia University, who didn't write very much, but he's more known for his wit and anecdotes about him and so on. And he explains this principle, the invariance principle, or why it would be silly to violate it. Essentially the principle says, well, if you have a preference between two options, apples over bananas, a third option becomes available, that third option shouldn't affect your preference ranking between the other two. And here is how he explains that. So imagine you're in a restaurant, you just had your dinner, and then the waitress comes and asks you what you want for pudding, and that place apparently specializes in pie. And so, which pie would you like, apple or blueberry? Apple. So she goes away, comes back, and says, well, I just heard that we also have cherry pie. In this case, I'd like the blueberry. And that, of course, seems silly, right? And so this contextual feature, well, perhaps shouldn't affect our preferences. But you can easily construct formally identical scenarios where it seems very reasonable to change your preference. And I come to one in a minute, but just because he's so well known for the anecdotes, I'm going to tell you a few of those. So this is J.L. Austin, the philosopher of language. And apparently, Morgenbesser was sitting in a talk given by Austin, and was excruciatingly boring. He would go on and on and on about the fact that in many languages there's the double negative, the double negation, but not a double affirmative, right? And go on and on and on. And so there's no double affirmative, and eventually he'd sit and say, yeah. This other story involves, so he liked to smoke the pipe, as you see, and at the time, it was already forbidden actually on the New York subway to smoke the pipe, but he just lit it as he came up the stairs from a subway station, and but he was, policeman stopped him and said, like, you can't do this, and he just said, like, well, no, I didn't smoke downstairs, I didn't smoke on the train, I just lit it up. And anyway, there's no smoking on the subway, and went back and forth. And eventually the guy said, like, well, look, I can't really let you do that. If I'd let you do it, I'd have to let everyone do it. To which he responded, who are you, And then he was arrested and had a hard time explaining why he said that. Failure of invariance. So here's the structurally identical case to the case about the blueberry and apple pie and so on, where it seems to be reasonable, perhaps, to make a choice on the preference. So suppose you're at a conference and you meet an acquaintance. So the acquaintance is local, you're coming in from outside, and you're not friends, you're just acquaintances, but you know each other, and your acquaintance asks you, well, would you like some tea, at my place, or do you want to retire to the hotel? Nah, I should really go home, prepare my talk for tomorrow. Well, in fact, there's cocaine as well, in which case I'd love some tea. So this example is actually due to Amartya Sen, who, of course, formulated it in opposite terms, right? But the Sen's point here is that giving a third option gives you some information about the context of the choices, right? And so if one is suddenly offered cocaine, it's going to be a very different choice, even between tea and going home, than without being given that choice. And so here is a formally identical scenario where it seems very reasonable to actually change your preferences once you are given the third option. And one last case here. This is game theory, actually, and it's called the trust game. And the trust game goes as follows. An investor, oh, it does work, actually. Can you see the red dot at all? Oh, sorry, it's very weak. Anyway, an investor is given the choice to either keep some money to himself or transfer the endowment to a trustee. If he gives it to the trustee, the money is quintupled, and then the trustee has the choice between either keeping that larger amount to himself or splitting it back with the investor. And again, what I explained earlier in economics, because you're not allowed to make any substantive choices about people's preferences, and only choices, about about completeness and so on, formal aspects. You have to measure the people's preferences, or elicit. You have to ask people essentially for their preferences, and then you use that information to make predictions. And what is done in the game theoretical cases is that very often you let players play sub-games, and then you use that information and plug it into a larger game and make a prediction about what people do in the larger game. Now the problem here with this is that this sub-game here, so the second node that starts with a trustee making the decision, should I split the money that we made, or should I keep it all to myself, is in fact a version of the so-called dictator game, in which somebody just gets an endowment and is asked to split that pie or not with a second player, but the second player has no choice at all in the matter, right? And now in the dictator game, many people actually choose left. They can't be punished for their actions. Why wouldn't you, in such a scenario, why wouldn't you keep a lot of money to yourself? However, if you measure the people's preferences and then plug them into the larger game, people choose differently. And the reason is that it seems to make a difference to people without just being given the endowment and asked to split it between themselves and a stranger, or whether that stranger has actually helped to create the endowment. And so even though the trustee cannot be punished for his action, he will just get, he'll just get the 50. But nevertheless, he feels that, because the investor actually helped to create the pie, therefore I reward him. Or, norms of equity and desert play a role, and so on. And so you cannot just use the preference in the second game to make a prediction about what happens in the larger game, because the context has changed, and as it seems, in a very reasonable way. And that presents a problem actually for, don't worry about that. That presents a problem for rational choice theory, because economists do not like to make substantive assumptions. They would like to have a purely formal theory of rational choice. And so here's just a quote from a methodologist, and just to explain how economists want a purely formal theory. So that an agent is rational from RCT's, rational choice theory's, point of view does not mean that the course of action she will choose is objectively optimal. Desires do not have to align with any objective measure of goodness. I may want to risk swimming in a crocodile-infested lake. I may desire to smoke or drink even though I know it harms me. Optimality is determined by the agent's desire, not the converse. However, the story I told you about context dependence of the preferences shows that if you want to do empirical work using preferences, you simply cannot do that without making substantive assumptions about actually what is better for agents. And so in practice, substantive assumptions, of course, are made. So for instance, in game theory, an assumption called dominance is often added. And dominance means that the monetary payoffs of a game dominate all contextual considerations. However, we know that that is not true. I mean, I've just given you an example, and you just see in many experiments that that assumption is constantly violated. And so you can, of course, always make some other assumption to save game theory or to save rational choice theory. But these fixes, so to speak, are very often ad hoc. And we don't have a good theory of how context is allowed to affect your preferences. Now, my own view about this whole matter is I don't really work on rational choice theory, but because it's so important in economics, I decided to talk about it. And my own view is that individuals' behavior, whether rational or not, is really an epiphenomenon of the socioeconomic structure in which it is embedded. And so I think from an explanatory point of view, it's more important to talk about these socioeconomic structures. And so I'm not very interested in. But if we must have a theory of rational choice, then it must be one that makes substantive assumptions about behavior. And it seems to me that philosophers are in a good position to contribute to the development of such a theory. Because, well, after all, I mean, they've been debating the nature of rationality for more than 2,000 years, and they're experts in explanation of the nature of scientific theory, and so on and so forth. So here's one area where engagement between philosophers and economists might be fruitful. Second case, within methodology. So the causal wars are currently raging in econometrics between two schools. One school has been given the label theory-based econometrics, and the other school design-based econometrics. Theory-based essentially means, or their main idea is, in order to estimate the causal effect of some x on y using econometric methods, we have to build a causal model, which has to be based on rational choice theory, fundamentally, which tells us about the conditioning variables, functional form of the regression, and so on and so forth. So all we can use observations only against a causal model, and that causal model has to come from rational choice theory, essentially. Now, there's a recent movement very much interested in policy analysis, that assumptions of this kind, such as dominance, which you need for empirical applications, are subjective. Aren't they? Rightly so, in a way, because they are false, right? And should be reduced to a minimum. And just to illustrate that this is really a movement rather than, just just some idea within economics. So here's the book, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, by Josh Angrist and Jörn Stefan Pischke. And so they have a blog as well. So imagine that. There's an econometrics book and textbook, and they have a blog and talking about these highly political issues. Do smaller classes increase learning? Do minimum wages reduce unemployment? All causal claims, highly politically sensitive. And then you can get merchandise, actually. So these are the T-shirts to wear while reading Mostly Harmless Econometrics or fixing your standard errors. And if you're really devoted and you happen to have become parents just now, you can get T-shirts for babies even, and instill the teachings on them. Anyway, the proponents of this movement advocate a design-based approach to econometrics, and their main idea is to analyze well-designed, naturally occurring or randomized experiments instead of observational data, using these causal models that come from these subjective assumptions. Now, the idea seems to be epistemic warrant, the justification for our causal conclusions should derive from design rather than from subjective background assumptions. Of course, theory-based econometricians demur. Experiments introduce artifacts. They can answer only a very narrow range of questions. Designs are likely to be flawed unless based on theory. Now, if you ask a methodologist, how might he or she be able to arbitrate? Well, here's a proposal by pointing out instances of fallacious reasoning. And here I just want to mention one reasoning mistake on each side. And so, just to repeat, the design-based guy says, randomized or whatever, experimentation is the gold standard of causal inference, right? In order to learn about causal claim, perform an experiment. But we know from Mill that what we really need to do is observe the right kind of situation. And just, I wanted to illustrate that with a quote from Mill, but then I just came across a nice passage from Fraser, and where he explains scientific method, and actually exactly Mill's method of difference. And so I let Fraser do the explanation of Mill's method of difference. Oh, sorry. Oh, shit. Sorry. I should mention the context, actually. And the context is, I'm sure you all know Fraser. He's, of course, single again. A new neighbor moves into his building. She happens to be a matchmaker. And she wants to sign him up, but he demurs initially. But then, by some feat of fate, he does sign up. And now he meets with Roz, his producer, in a cafe and explains that. And she gives him some dating tips. So I have to do this again. So here we go.
So I gave her the money, and I filled out the questionnaire.
You fudged a little bit on your answers, right?
No, of course not. Why would I?
Because nobody's honest on those things. There's a code people use. Like, mature means old. Athletic means flat-chested. And, not model thin means circus fat.
Oh, gosh, she's already set me up on a date this evening. But I assure you, I am more interested in personality than looks.
Did you see a photo at least?
Of course I saw a photo. She's got a personality you can bounce a quarter off on.
So where are you taking her?
Paris. I tend to take all subsequent dates there as well. That way I can compare them objectively. You see, as the woman will be the only variable. It's basic science.
Yeah. That's been your dating problem. Not enough science.
And it's just, I love Fraser, and there's actually, in my view, there's something like that for every aspect of life, and it's just so brilliant. He mentions objectivity, science, he explains Mill's method of difference, and then he has Ross, who's skeptical about applying the scientific method in the wrong context. And it's just so brilliant. Unfortunately, what I need from Mill is slightly more subtle. And when Mill defines his method of difference, he says, well, look, we do causal inferences by observing two situations which are exactly identical. Of course, we'll never find two situations that are exactly identical, so we need two situations that are identical with respect to all the causally relevant factors. And then if there's a variation in one factor which makes a difference to the outcome, then that factor is the cause of the outcome. But what's important, and what we learn from Mill, is that all causal inference proceeds by interpreting an observation on the basis of causal background knowledge, the knowledge about the causal structure of the situation. So experiments are meant to create situations that have the right causal properties. But what matters for inference is only whether the situations have the right properties, not why they have them. And you can call that the generative fallacy. So it doesn't matter what the reason is for the situations to be exactly identical, except with respect to one factor. It only matters that it has that the two situations have the right causal properties. Sorry, what's that? Oh, sorry. Damn. We don't want to watch the clip again, do we? Sorry about that. Now here's a reasoning mistake on the other side, on the side of the theory-based econometricians. So they argue that econometric studies are only trustworthy if the econometric model is derived from a theoretical model. Now there's some ambiguity what an acceptable theoretical model is, but again, from a causal point of view, what matters for the inference is whether the variable does have the right causal properties. And there are at least some examples where we can learn that situations have the right causal properties on the basis of historical and institutional background knowledge, which doesn't come from rational choice theory, right? And so you can call this the epistemic fallacy. So it doesn't matter how we know it, from theory, from institutional historical background knowledge, or from whatever, but it only matters that we know it in order to be justified in doing the inference. And so the upshot then is philosophers can contribute to debates such as this by clarifying concepts, pointing out instances of fallacious reasoning, and drawing attention to historical parallels that have been solved in one way or another. Naturally not without empirical input, so we need mutual engagement, but philosophers can help here. My last case, facts and values. Now, by and large, not everybody, but by and large, economists are firm believers in the fact-value dichotomy. And again, a few quotes. This is from a very prominent textbook in macroeconomics. Here are two statements you might hear. Greg Mankiw says, poly, for positive economics, poly, minimum wage laws cause unemployment. Norma, the government should raise the minimum wage. Ignoring for now whether you agree with these statements, notice that Polly and Norma differ in what they are trying to do. Polly is speaking like a scientist. She's making a claim about how the world works. Norma is speaking like a policy advisor. She's making a claim about how she would like to change the world. In general, statements about the world are of two types. One type, such as Polly's, is positive. Positive statements are descriptive. They make a claim about how the world is. The second type of statements, such as Norma's, is normative. Normative statements are prescriptive. They make a claim about how the world ought to be. And lastly, very important, a key difference between positive and normative statements is how we judge their validity. We can, in principle, confirm or refute positive statements by examining evidence. An economist might evaluate Polly's statements by analyzing data on changes in minimum wages and changes in the unemployment rate over time. By contrast, evaluating normative statements involves values as well as facts. Norma statement cannot be judged using data alone. Deciding what is good or bad policy is not merely a matter of science, it also involves our views on ethics, religion, and political philosophy. And you see, there are all these oppositions here that come up in that description. So you have the scientist versus the policy advisor, positive or descriptive versus normative or prescriptive, how the world is versus how the world ought to be, examining evidence, objective, versus views on ethics, religion, and political philosophy, which cannot be supported by evidence. That is science versus non-science, opinion, faith, sentiment, intuition, or what have you. Good versus bad. Yeah, I think I just said that. So positive statements in principle can be supported by evidence. Normative statements have to be judged on the basis of these weird things, bad things, values, intuition, what have you. This is Lionel Robbins, actually, so who says how we can establish statements involving value judgments. If we disagree about ends, it is a case of thy blood or mine, or live and let live. But if we disagree about means, then scientific analysis can often help us resolve our differences. If we disagree about morality, then there's no room for argument. Whereas Milton Friedman, differences about value are differences about which men can ultimately only fight. So, unfortunately, though, the strict separation into a purely value-free economics, factual, positive, what have you, economics, and a value-laden, normative, ideational, perhaps, economics, doesn't hold up to critical scrutiny. Facts and values are deeply entangled in many, many different aspects of science. We've already seen rationality. It's one case. You cannot have a purely formal theory of rationality. I'm going to talk here about concept formation, but there are other areas as well. For instance, in modeling, because modeling involves selection of aspects that are significant, theory testing, and choice of methods. But I will only talk about concept formation here. So like ordinary language, economists often use concepts that have a mixed descriptive and evaluative content. And so here are some examples, and I used them just before the lecture, actually. I skim-read an article on the financial crisis, and these are all taken, all these words are taken from this article explaining the causes of the financial crisis. So here are some, all of these both describe a situation, but they also express a sentiment about that situation, a normative judgment about the situation. Excessive risk-taking. It's not only a lot of risk-taking, it's too much. It's bad kind of risk-taking. The underprivileged. Culprit. Culprit only talks about causation, really. You know, what's the cause? But the person, I mean, the author calls it the culprit. Subprime, perhaps. You know, subprime lending, too much subprime lending. So is that perhaps? I'm not sure whether that's normative and positive as well. Depression, of course, financial panic, delinquent. All these concepts that we use to describe an economic phenomenon such as the financial crisis have descriptive and normative aspects intertwined. Now, when we use these concepts, we describe a situation, but we also express approval and disapproval. This is really interesting. A bond is a promise to pay. You know, that makes this it's just a contract between two parties, but it's really bad if one party violates the contract, right? Because he's made a promise, and it's bad to not to honor promises. Or second quote here, there was also an unrated equity tranche to provide extra safety to the investors. So that's a good thing, right? So it's not just a descriptive statement stating a fact. And now these concepts are called thick ethical concepts, where descriptive and normative aspects are intertwined. And you might, of course, argue that, well, so some philosophers have argued that they're indispensable to the extent that we do in economics that is meant to be policy relevant, you know, to our lives. We will have to use concepts like this. However, you could say, well, look, actually what we can do is we objectify these kinds of concepts by measuring them. So, for instance, you know, we define them in terms of some explicit and transparent measurement procedure. So rather than saying, for instance, banks were making active efforts to lend to the underprivileged, we can call the latter poor and have some index that measures poverty. The problem with that is that indicators, economic indicators such as poverty measures, you also use judgments about both facts and values. And the case study I looked at in my earlier book is consumer price inflation. And I like that better than looking at poverty because, if you talk about poverty, it's pretty clear that, considerations of justice and equity and so on will matter. However, if you talk about consumer price inflation, that really seems to be a fact out there. But alas, it's not. And so just a few more minutes about consumer price inflation. Details of measurement procedures enormously affect the result of the measurement procedure in economics. And here's an example. This is a toy example, actually, from me here, just to demonstrate that, that fact. And here you have 2 periods and two goods, cocoa and cloves, and with their respective prices and quantities. And depending on which index you use to aggregate these prices and quantities, you have radically different statements about inflation, ranging from 25% plus to 20% minus, just depending on the index number that you use. Of course, this is an extreme by means an artificial example to make this point. However, it's simply an empirical fact that details about a measurement procedure affect the result quite dramatically. Now, measuring inflation by the consumer price index involves value judgment to quite some extent. So, for example, in the late 1990s, there was a debate in the United States about the accuracy of the CPI as a measure of inflation. And so there was a Boston Commission to study the consumer price index, and it found that the consumer price index overstated true inflation, whatever that is, by 1.1 percentage points each year. Actually, 0.7% of that total was entirely based on value judgments. And here are some examples. So to measure inflation adequately, one needs some background assumptions concerning facts. So what the Boston Commission recommends is that the current price index should actually be replaced by an index that tracks not the value of a fixed basket of goods, but rather of a fixed level of utility. So use more theory in measuring inflation. But to the extent that we want to use this, we of course need to know whether people actually choose according to that model of choice, right? And so you need some knowledge about facts. How do actually consumers react to relative price changes? Do they react in accordance to that model? But also values, and this is of course the important point here. So 0.7% concerned mostly quality changes. And they're a really different thing to measure, because essentially a price index measures the development of the value for a fixed basket of goods, but then the goods continuously change. So you used to have an old Mercedes, now you have a new new model of Mercedes. It's 20% more expensive. It also does other things. And you need to evaluate in one way or another how much better that new model is. And economists assume that if people prefer something, then it's better for them, which is highly, highly contentious. But even if you do assume that, you cannot solve that problem of having to make a judgment about how much a quality change affects your well-being, simply because from a choice, you can only see that it's good for a consumer, but not how much better it is. Sorry, that it's better, but not how much better it is. And therefore, in one way or another, you have to judge whether or not a new good is, in some way or another, better for the consumer. And that's the main thing, really. But also you have to judge whether it's the same whether I buy a good in a traditional outlet or in a discounter or over the internet, and all sorts of aspects like that, which simply cannot be read off from the observations. And together, these changes actually make up the majority of that perceived discrepancy between measured inflation and what they call true inflation. And also purposes, but I won't talk about this now. Don't worry about that. And you have that all over the place in economic indicators. And here are just some examples, but I won't go through them. The exact same points where facts and values are entangled pop up again in the measurement of unemployment, of GDP, and many, many other economic indicators. And of course, philosophers might help to get the values sorted. Anyway, so these are my conclusions. I want to end with an analysis, a recommendation, and a prediction. So the analysis is that those on the wrong side of the debate, so, I've now argued that we need more engagement with ethics, that, it's a good idea to, make concrete substantive assumptions and not just formal assumptions. And anyway, I didn't talk so much about induction, but all those guys, in a sense, were on the wrong side. Sorry. What I mean by the wrong side of the debate is all those winners in those debates. So Mill versus Jones. So Mill is the winner, but he's wrong from the point of view of what I'm saying here. Or Schmoller versus Menger. Menger is wrong from the point of view of what I've been saying here. All those on the wrong side of the debate really have an honorable intention, and that is to make economics an objective science. However, but what they mean by objective is a science that proves its results, say deductively using mathematics, that has certain ideas about scientific method, for instance, the experimental method, that makes these inferences free from background assumptions, which might be subjective, and that is a value-free science. So they have the honorable intention to, make economics an objective science, but they have this strange concept of objectivity, because objectivity is a good thing, but only a good thing to the extent that it inspires trust in a science, that it promotes trust in science. However, if the financial crisis has shown anything, then trust in economics is currently very low. And so the recommendation would be that we might achieve objectivity in the sense of promoting trust in other ways. For example, in other ways than to insist on more mathematics, fewer background assumptions, and on no values. For instance, we might just say, put the values on the table and discuss them. Put the background assumptions on the table, and so on. There might be alternative ways to promote trust, than those ways. And so there might be alternative senses of objectivity in economics. And then lastly, to end on a conciliatory note, I want to make a prediction, and the prediction is that the objectivists, in that sense, will win once more, and we'll have the same debate again in 50 to 60 years. Thank you.